global application security leader from PepsiCo. He was a former hold on, I'm going to wait. You want to give it like another minute? Yeah, but let me just talk for a few minutes. Okay, I have Amelio Wright. He's a global application security leader from PepsiCo. Formerly, he was an ethical hacker at Paylocity. As a seasoned navigator of digital frontier, Amelio brings on the stage a wealth of knowledge from the trenches of the software engineering, architecture, and security with an executive MBA from Southwestern Methodist University. Fueling his strategic acumen, he has honed his expertise in forging scalable systems that not only solve intricate business challenges, but also customer excellence. Amelio's odyssey in tech began with the meticulous realm of software quality assurance when he innovated a no-code solution that empowered testers and enabled business to flourish unimpeded. Evolved into a developer and architect, he designed solutions to unravel complex business logic, scaling the demands of growth to the market capability. He's done all kinds of things. You can see on his long bio, one of our vendors actually suggested that we get Amelio as our keynote speaker. It's very fun to have someone that's a little different from what we've had in the past. And I'm excited to hear from him, and we're excited that PepsiCo could approve him to be here today. So today he is going to be speaking on Blueprint for Excellence, constructing a world-class global AppSec program. Before I turn it over to Amelio, I want to remind everyone that we will take some time for Q&A, but please wait for my tech team to come and bring you the mic, because again, we have about 200 virtual viewers out there that want to hear your questions as well. And for my virtual viewers out there, we want to make sure you're included. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box, and my team will make sure he asks Amelio your question as well. So everyone, let's welcome Amelio Wright to the stage.
All right. Thanks, Kim, for the really warm introduction. Thank you all for being here today. So what we're going to talk about is application security and doing it at a global scale. So I've got to start out by defining what application security is, because it's such a broad topic, and I've seen it described and defined in many different ways. So application security, it's not just a practice, but it's also a mindset, and it's a way of organizational behavior. So the way I've defined it, it's a mindset, it's a practice, it's a way of bringing together people, process, and technology to really detect, remediate, and prevent vulnerable findings in software, not just web applications. I've heard application security just defined as targeting web applications, but it also targets your APIs, your microservices, your middle-tier services, mobile applications, anything that runs code that connects endpoints together. That's what we're concerned about for application security. So now that we're past the definition, let's kind of go over what we're going to be talking about today. So what we're going to be talking about is we're going to start with a theoretical kind of company that I've come up with called DevCorp. We're going to talk about the humble roots that DevCorp started with, their rise, their claim to fame, and then their ultimate demise, and what caused their demise. And then we're going to spend the rest of the talk unraveling that and working through it. And so after we wrap up with DevCorp's demise, I'm going to introduce kind of the key takeaways of my talk. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps and how that's important to application security. what DevSecOps is and how that adds another layer onto DevOps. And then I'm going to get into my kind of key points and takeaways on application security and how the things that have worked well for me, the things that haven't worked well for me, and things that I'm kind of thinking about in the industry right now, and what I'm working through in scaling application security globally in an organization that's several hundreds of thousands of employees. And so we start with DevCorp. Now, DevCorp was not founded by Samir and Michael Bolton. The picture is just for attention. But DevCorp is a company that was founded in 1998. And the company was founded as a small kind of boutique IT consulting firm. And their initial project that they took on was working with a accounting firm, Watson & Johnson LLP, to migrate their systems to the Y2K. So they were trying to solve the Y2K problem for this accounting firm. And this accounting firm, mid-sized accounting firm between 200 and 300 employees in the Bay Area, somewhere around 300 million in revenue. Mid-sized company, and they were brought in to solve this Y2K problem. And so initially they pitched to the firm that it was going to be a $2 million project, and immediately the firm rejected it. And so the founders of DevCorp, I'll call them Ollie and Elliot, they had to go back and rethink, their strategy. And what they were doing was they were focusing on onshore developers only, because at that time, that was the most common thing to do back in 1998. And so they then discovered that they could actually look towards offshore developers. And so that's what they started to do. And then they were able to come back and revise their pitch, and they were able to bring the costs of their Y2K migration down to like 300,000, something like that. And so the firm, they jumped on that. And they were like, OK, this is really cool. This is great. And so they executed on the project amazingly well. They didn't introduce a Millennium bug. Again, pictures just for attention. But they got off to a great start. And so before we move on to kind of the fast forward today of where DevCorp is at, I want to take a brief step through time. So a brief interlude. And so I'm going to ask everyone out in the audience, does anybody know what we're looking at? Raise of hands. Anybody? What are we looking at? Yes, but the underlying, what's powering this page, this web page? Any guesses? So in 1995, JavaScript was created by Brendan Eich. And shortly thereafter, the first cross-site scripting vulnerability was discovered. But it wasn't documented until the year 2000 by someone in Microsoft. And so I'll go to the next slide. Does anyone know what we're looking at here? I know I kind of gave it away on the bottom, but I've highlighted a couple of things. Yeah, it's SQL injection. So in 1998, I'll call him a security researcher, as the current socially acceptable term, by the handle of Rainforest Puppy, discovers SQL injection. And I've gone ahead and highlighted two boxes. This is actually the original email thread that I think he posted to a bulletin board that I was able to dig up, where he said, yeah, we went ahead and reported this to Microsoft, but Microsoft said it wasn't actually a problem and we don't need to fix it. But I've gone ahead and disclosed to them that we can actually do this trick, at the time they called it, where they would escape the SQL statement and add some characters on the end to then be able to ignore everything before the quotation mark and just run their SQL statement. And so they found the first SQL injection vulnerability. And again, I don't think it was documented until later. So we skip ahead to the year 2005, arguably 2005, maybe it was 2004. So I was able to go and capture two things. I gave away the first one, but does anybody know what I'm looking at on the right-hand side? Tom. He was everybody's best friend in 2005, right? Tom was like the friend to the world. Now we have probably the best contender to Tom. So MySpace introduced a really interesting thing. They enabled their users to create custom content as their sort of profile page. Now, I know I had custom content at the time. I was like 14. I was like, I can write my own HTML. This is really cool. So I did it, and I had my own profile song and all that. I think it was probably like a Green Day song or something like that. Enter this gentleman by the name Sammy. Now, at the time, Sammy was a pretty lonely guy. He wanted to make a lot of friends on Facebook, MySpace, really quickly. And so Sammy figured out that if he wrote some JavaScript, he would actually be able to introduce, I think it was a stored cross-site scripting attack, where if whoever came to his custom profile would automatically send him a friend request. And I was able to actually capture that source code, by the way. And to add a kicker to that, whoever visited his page, that JavaScript got injected on their custom profile. And so whoever visited that person's page that visited his page would also automatically send him a friend request. Now, for Sammy, this had really interesting consequences. I think the first couple of hours, he had a couple of 100 friend requests, and he was like, yeah, this is great, this is cool, this is awesome, I love it. But then the next day, he realized that he had like tens of thousands of friend requests. And he was like, oh, this is probably not good. I'm going to get caught, and people are going to be really mad at me. So Sammy then decided to shut the whole thing down, but I think he actually did get caught. And so I was able to find a picture of him actually speaking about this thing because he got caught. I don't think he got in any trouble, but it was more like, hey, this is probably not good. We should fix this. But essentially what he did was he injected, but most of all, Sammy is my hero on your profile page with some custom HTML. In 2014, going ahead 9-10 years, we can see that the issue is actually still pretty prevalent. Did anybody use TweetDeck? Anybody? One, two, yeah, I mean, I used TweetDeck because I was in college between 2008 and 2012, and TweetDeck was just a way for me to simplify communicating to MySpace, Twitter, and you essentially were able to use TweetDeck to post one thing to all the platforms at the time. And so another, what I'll call security researcher at the time, discovered that he could actually create a tweet with JavaScript in it, and in TweetDeck, that JavaScript would execute, and it enabled all kinds of account compromises and takeovers and things like that, because you just essentially just run whatever JavaScript that you wanted to. So in 2014, this issue is still top of the list. And so we're going to skip ahead to present day, and we're going to talk about kind of the downfall of DevCorp. And so to kind of move on to the next part of the story for DevCorp, DevCorp at this time, they're in a pinch. And so they grew really quickly over the, what I'll say, 26-ish year span. And they became kind of a global IT consulting firm. and they were in a situation where they weren't able to attract and retain the talent that they needed to service all of their clients. And so DevCorp started hiring a lot of junior developers. And one junior developer in particular, we'll call him Dade, was given a project to, and now this is totally a theoretical, hypothetical project. This is going to sound silly, but I had to come up with something. He was given a project to essentially build a search function on a page to search a bookstore's database for books and just return a list of titles. And now Dade was given this project, and he had like a 2-day turnaround time. And Dade thought about how he wanted to do this. He was told that he had to write it in PHP. He hadn't worked with PHP before, and he needed to take a shortcut. So we enter the ChatGPT problem. When used correctly, ChatGPT is great. I personally don't say no to ChatGPT. But what I do say is you need to have guardrails around your use for ChatGPT. Now, at this time, DevCorp was integrated into, they had their own CI/CD pipelines. They were using GitHub. They had source control. They had all the right guardrails in place. But again, Dade had a 2-day turnaround time. So he had very tight expectations for timeline. And so Dade went out to ChatGPT and he asked, you're a software engineer. You're working on a feature to take an input from a user on a website and search a book database for titles to return to a page based on the filters. So you have to query a database and return the values. And so ChatGPT responded accordingly. OK, great. To create that PHP script, you're going to have to do a couple of things. But don't worry, I'll give you the source code for all those things. And so ChatGPT returned a couple of different things, but I paid very specific attention to one of the things that it returned. So I'll give everyone just like a couple of seconds to look at the code. Does anyone see a problem with this code? Anybody? Raise of hands. If you see it, and ignore the hard-coded creds. That's an obvious problem. But other than the hard-coded creds, show of hands, does anyone see a problem? What do you think the problem is?
There's no validation over there.
That's one. Well, elaborate. What do you mean no validation?
Like the inputs are directly injected into SQLite.
Yes. Yeah. So if you look over on the right-hand side, if you see $SQL equals select star from books where title like search title, ChatGPT gave me a SQL injection vulnerability. And so I took this and I was like, no way, because I saw this right away. And I'm just like, you know what, I know it's a problem. Let me run it through a SaaS tool really quick. And of course, the SaaS tool saw the vulnerability. And so, I went back and I asked ChatGPT, I'm like, hey, ChatGPT, does this code contain AppSec vulnerabilities? And it responded back with, yeah, it actually does. and here's how you fix it. I'm not kidding. Like, I have this, the whole history in my ChatGPT of this exchange. And so now, this ultimately led to the demise of DevCorp, because what had happened was the CI/CD pipelines had the right checks in place. They were failing. They were failing the build, but Dade had 2 days to deliver this feature. And Dade went to his project manager, like, look, I can't release this because it's failing. I don't know why it's failing. I can't see the results or the reports or anything. I don't have time to log into those systems to get those reports or look at the results. We have to get this out. Project manager said, OK, just turn off those steps. And so the developer, Dade turned them off. He promoted the build. It went out, passed QA, because QA at DevCorp only looks at user acceptance testing, right? They only look at the functionality. The functionality works, It's great, fine, good to go. And so what ultimately ends up happening is not shortly thereafter, this bookstore, they're breached. They're hit with a SQL injection attack. Their data is exposed. And so DevCorp's reputation immediately goes down, makes headline news, and that's the demise for DevCorp. And so that's the story of DevCorp. We're going to talk about a lot of those things a little bit more in detail as I go through the main meat and body of the talk. But as we do that, I want to, if nothing else that you take away from this talk other than ChatGPT is really scary, two things. So what we're looking at here is a bridge that's held together by some rope. It's just hanging, and it's over it's pretty high up. It's over a really quickly running body of water, but there's an individual, there's a human, and this human has their hand out, and they're saying, you know what, it's okay, don't be afraid, we're going to cross this bridge together. Now, what I'll say is that application security is about being this human and helping the person on the other side of the bridge feel that they have hope, that they trust you, and that you empathize with their fear, and that you're going to help them cross this bridge hand in hand. So that's one key takeaway that we're gonna continue to talk about throughout this talk. And I want to make sure that this is something that, if nothing else, that's one of the goals of application security, is to cross the bridge between development and security hand in hand. And then another thing that I want a key takeaway. So what we're looking at here is a screenshot of an episode of The Office. And there's 4 people. You can only see 3 because it was really hard to capture all 4. The episode didn't do it in any specific way. So we have development, we have IT operations, we have security, and we have QA. QA is off the screen. And they're all finger gun pointing at each other like, hey, it's your fault for whatever reason about something. And what I want to make clear is that this is what we want to avoid. This is not what we want to happen in any capacity. These 4 people should actually all be working together in tandem as a core team to get from the start to finish. And we're going to talk about that. So let's start with a conversation around DevOps, deployments at the speed of business. Now, security is not involved yet. We're going to kind of go through an evolution. So DevOps was keyed, I think maybe 20 years ago or so when Agile became well known in the market. Well, not well known, but known well enough in the market, and teams like Microsoft came out with their software development lifecycle, their SDL, and started to implement things like DevOps. So deployments at the speed of business, except for QA. They always slow us down. And I joke about that because I actually started my career in QA. And at that time, back in 2012, I was actually told, like, hey, you've got to write your tests to pass. I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would I write my tests to pass? Well, because they get in the way. But that doesn't make any sense at all. We'll talk about that. And so what we're looking at here is, we're looking at the DevSecOps lifecycle. And so we first start by planning out our requirements and how we're going to write our development. The developers actually write their code to that plan, those specifications. We build the code, we test it, we run our unit tests. They pass, we package and compile that code into deployable artifacts that we can then deploy onto any number of environments. And After that we deploy it, we continue to monitor for errors, performance, user experience, things like that. We take the feedback from that monitoring, and then we continue to iterate on the process, introducing new requirements, but continuing to build on our testing and monitoring capabilities. And so one thing that you don't see here is security. Where's security in this picture? We've got QA captured, but we don't have security. So what we're doing right now is we're taking the requirements from our end users, and we are building those, and we're testing. And one of the actual challenges of this, so there's two things that I'll talk about. There's so raise of hands, and I'm sure I'm going to see a lot of hands. Who's heard the term CI/CD? Almost everybody. Yeah, and that makes sense. So CI/CD means the same thing, right? There's only one CI/CD. There's two. So you have continuous integration, but you also have continuous delivery versus continuous deployment. Continuous delivery and continuous deployment, they're almost the same thing. The only difference is continuous delivery has a manual step between going from your lower environments to your production environment. And so that manual step is the validation that occurs. So that's when QA comes in and our automated tests come in, and we're waiting for the results from those tests to pass, to return the findings that the features are good from a UAT perspective. Performance looks great. We're good. We trust our findings, our results. If there's any findings, those get fixed, and then we promote that package to production, and then we run our sanity tests. In continuous deployment, we have 100% automation coverage. We trust that automation, and teams are just able to deploy. They commit their code, and how much time that automation takes to run. From commit to production, that's the metric that we track. Now, the one key problem with continuous deployment is that the tests, now we're only talking about QA here. We haven't brought in security yet. But raise of hands, and I'm not sure how many hands I'm going to see, but I'm going to ask a question anyway. Who has been in QA or knows about QA practices? A couple people. Okay, so you might know what I'm talking about. But when you think about QA, and especially QA automation tests can take a pretty long time to run, because essentially what they do is they crawl the UI and they follow the specific instructions that you tell those tests to follow. So clicking on links, entering texts into text box, validating values, basically performing the actions that a normal tester would perform to validate the features that were introduced in that iteration. And when I was developing QA automation tests, oftentimes project managers would come to me and say, Amelio, these automation tests are taking like 5 hours to run. So that means the build is taking over 5 hours to run. We can't have these in our pipeline. It's just taking too long. And I'm like, okay, I hear you, but we can't not do any testing in the pipeline. And so the solution that I had to come up with was a way to reduce the testing to focus on, is the application still functioning? Like, are we still able to log in? Is it still up? Is it still accessible? What I would call smoke tests. And so, or canary tests. And so what I did was implement those, but still, rely on the testers as they were testing each feature before it was committed, relying on their results and ensuring that there were no outstanding critical bugs that would prevent the feature from going live to production, and then introducing smoke tests that would take, no more than half an hour. And that was pretty well received. And so what I also did was I tried something kind of different at the time that developers, it didn't interfere with what they were doing, but it gave them feedback. And so I essentially started to copy their builds and create what I called sidechain builds that would run my full automation, my test automation suite on their builds, but in a side chain, so it wouldn't impact their timelines. And I was still able to produce any bugs to them if I found any. So I was able to cut them Jira tickets and things like that if any issues were identified. So let's fast forward to DevSecOps. So we're kind of past the QA problem now. It's generally well accepted that QA works really well with development and IT operations. We've got kind of a good triangle going, a good cadence going. So now DevSecOps becomes the thing. Deployments at the speed of business, except now security is slowing us down. Who invited them to this show? Remember those key takeaways. And so what does DevSecOps look like? Well, it's the same thing. It's just security now encompasses all parts of the DevOps lifecycle. And so planning. Wouldn't it be cool if during planning you actually had some kind of mechanism to define your application security requirements? Now think about DevCorp and their Dade asking ChatGPT, hey ChatGPT, I've got this requirement, I need to do it in PHP, can you give me the code? What if Dade had just added a couple of more words onto his prompt that said, and please make sure this is free from application security vulnerabilities? And ChatGPT would have given him a very different response. I know that because I tested it. I just didn't put a screenshot in my deck. But yeah, that SQL, it actually gave me prepared statements instead of giving me a SQL injection vulnerability. And so if those requirements are defined up front, like, hey, I need to, say a developer gets a requirement and says, hey, I need to ensure that, I need to create an API endpoint to search this table for this field to filter on this value. Now, if you had some way to define all of the AppSec requirements that would have to go into that feature, then essentially it should be secure by default, because then that's something that you would have to test against. So one of the things that I had to do when I got started in application security, my journey was from development. So I was a developer for a long time. And when I was a developer, at the firm I was working at the time, the good friend of mine was actually the penetration tester for the firm. And he finally, one day, got around to testing my code. And I was responsible for developing tax software that did pretty complex calculations to calculate all the federal, state, local, municipal taxes to pay people all their payroll. And it turns out, in order to pay people, you have to know like a whole lot about them. Essentially, everything that's on your W-2, I have to know about that and store in a database in order to calculate your taxes and pay you. And so a friend of mine, who's a penetration tester at this firm, got around to testing my code, and he's like, Amelio, I got to talk to you, man. I'm like, okay, what's up? He's like, I got a problem with you. And I'm like, well, what's going on? And he says, I've got your database. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, I just dropped a SQL injection into your application, and I was able to extract your entire database. It's not even encrypted. Like, what are you doing? And I'm like, whoa, like, what are you talking about? Like, I just got some requirements. I built my software to the features, and it works. It works really good, actually. Like, you should look at that 30,000 line stored procedure that I had to convert into a managed like web application. That thing took a weekend. This takes 4 hours. It's amazing. He's like, sure, fine, that's cool, but like, I've got your database, and if I can get your database, does an attacker already have your database? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not good. He's like, yeah, it's fine. Let's just sit down and talk about this. So, I mean, he showed me what was going on. He walked me through the report and the results and the findings. So, I didn't really know what the findings meant because I didn't know anything about the OAuth top 10 at the time or AppSec vulnerabilities or anything like that. I was just trying to do my job. And so, I listened to what he had to say. I fixed my critical findings. And then I actually went out and learned a whole lot about the OAuth top 10 so I wouldn't make that mistake again. And so I actually took a lot of those learnings and I started bringing them back and applying it to my team. I had a pretty small team at the time. There was maybe like 8 of us developers on my team. And we became the first software security champions in the firm. And so this started to turn into a thing. And my friend at the firm I was working for said, Amelio, this is really cool. I love what you're doing. Could you do this for the other 400 developers in the firm? And it's like, sure, this is pretty cool. Why not? Now, this had a really interesting side effect because not only was I helping our developers learn about the OAuth top 10 and these really critical findings and how to digest and translate these complex pen test reports into plain English that developers could understand. But also, I was trying to help the QAs build very simple penetration test steps, if you will, into their functional testing. So, hey, I know you understand how SQL works. If you could actually play with this a little bit and add it into your functional tests, you might discover some vulnerabilities that we may not discover because our app gets pen tested once a year. I mean, I don't know how most people do pen tests at their firm, but does anyone's application get pen tested more than once a year, twice a year? I don't think so, especially when your AppSec team is 4 people versus 400 devs. There is no possible way your application is getting pen tested more than once or twice a year. And so what had happened when I introduced this was the QAs actually started finding some critical vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, broken authorization. And the executive team at the firm then came to my friend over in the penetration testing team and said, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you guys catching these findings that are critical in nature, but these QAs are? Like, well, we only have enough resources to pen test these apps once a year. They can do it every day. So of course they're going to catch more. And so this caught off like wildfire across the firm. And everyone loved it. And so we built out a full security champions program. And so we were able to not only implement this in the planning phase, the coding phase, where we were able to teach developers how to use things like static analysis tools, software composition analysis on their own local builds, but we were also able to implement those in the CI/CD pipelines. Now, and I'll get to this, maybe I'll wait, but we were able to empower the QAs to do security testing, lightweight, and yeah, just introduce continuous monitoring. And so now I'm going to move into the key takeaways for application security. So going back to my first key takeaway, if you take away nothing else from this talk, hear this. The 3 tent poles that I personally keep me up and have been successful for me in my career. 3 things: hope, trust, and empathy. And I say those 3 things because oftentimes in security, we're seen as the adversary. Raise of hands. Who has been told in their career as a security practitioner that they're an adversary? Or have you felt that way? I'm going to see a lot of hands. Yeah, a lot of hands. And so in application security, we have a golden opportunity to partner with our friends in development and help them understand that, like, look, we're not there to stop you. We're not there to break the build. We can't break the build. We can't. Unless it's for a good reason. Unless it's for the top 10% of findings that we know are truly critical in nature. We can't introduce tools that create noise. So we, as application security practitioners, to scale, we have to work with security governance. We have to work with security governance to ensure that the right policies, standards, specifications are in place. Things like SIS Control 16, a few of the NIST standards, 37, 53, 190, 218. Those are just some examples. But not only do we have to make sure that those standards and policies are in place, but we have to make sure that those standards and policies are translated in a way that developers, project managers, non-security people can understand. Because I can generally understand what these governance things are talking about because I've been in the game long enough. But going back to my story of when I was a developer and these things were introduced to me, I didn't know what he was talking about. I was looking at SAST findings, pen test findings. I could follow the steps to reproduce, but the recommended fixes were so general in nature that I might not have wanted to fix my code that way. I might have wanted to do it a little bit differently or introduce mitigating, compensating controls in another way, further up or down the stack. Because maybe the recommended fix would break my application. And I will tell you, if you introduce any level of friction for developers, they will find a way around you. And I know this because when I was a developer and security said I couldn't have local admin rights on my machine, I got local admin rights. At a firm I was working for, we had this cool thing called Power Broker. And Power Broker gave developers local admin rights on a very specific file path on the drive because we needed our source code to run in an admin mode. And so I just dropped a script in that folder to add myself to the local admins group. It worked until I rebooted the machine, but then I dropped that in the startup folder, and hey, every time I booted up, I got local admin rights. Can't tell me no, because I'll figure out how to do it. Another way that I did it when I was a QA, before I had that Power Broker access, if I had Visual Studio installed, I found this really cool add-on. Now, this is going back like over 10 years, so I don't think it exists anymore. Maybe it does. But Visual Studio had this add-on called like Power Tools or something. And when you fired up Power Tools, you got an admin shell because Visual Studio had to run in administrator mode. And so when I got that admin shell, I added myself to local admin that way. I got what I needed to get to do my job efficiently and effectively. And so if your AppSec tools, STAST, DAST, SCA, IAST, container scanning, if any of those tools create noise and create friction for the developers, they're going to kick you out. they're going to kick you out of their builds. Just in the same case of DevCorp. The developer date, he couldn't get to his results, he couldn't get to his findings, he had to log into a jump box to then log into the remote server where the static analysis tool was running because the findings weren't published to the pipeline, and he didn't have time for that. He turned it off, and he didn't understand what was going on. And so the other thing is that if these tools take too long, just in the case of my QA automation story, where my automation tests were taking too long, they'll kick you out for that too. And so if I can't break the build, I'll have to come up with policies that are very specific and very targeted, and they actually target what matters. And if I can't have tests that run too long, what are my options? The same case as when I implemented my QA automation tests in a sidechain build. That's another option for application security testing as well. You could implement your lightweight critical path testing in the CI/CD pipelines, because we don't want to not do application security testing in the pipelines, just in the case of DevCorp. You could implement your critical path in the pipelines, and then have your heavy hitters, the ones that take a long time, produce all the findings, run in a sidechain build, or by monitoring your commits, your source code check-ins. And that way you're able to provide a holistic view of all the findings. But you want to make sure that you capture only the findings that matter. And so as an application security team, in order to scale this, it's your responsibility to test all the rule sets and cut out everything that is producing false positives. The other thing that I will say is 5 tools should never mean 5 reports. Has anyone heard of the term report fatigue? Too many reports in too many places? If this is the case, the developers are never going to go look at the reports because they don't have time. When I was trying to get features out, I was on 2-week sprints. QA had like 3 days to test. By the time I got my feature done, QA had like 3 days to test. They're going to get through their tests. We're not going to have time to go out to all these different jump boxes and try to pull our results down, analyze these 300-page reports. No freaking way. And so all of your findings have to be centrally managed. They have to be cut to one central finding system. So all of your application security testing tools, they need to go to where your developers play. Who are your customers and where do they play? Just like in business, it's no different than in application security or anything else. So whether that be Jira, Azure DevOps, Bugzilla, GitHub, any of those things, all of your tools, all the findings from your tools need to be 1, cleansed of false positives, and 2, centrally located. And so we move on to a couple of other things that help scale global application security programs. And so there's this really cool thing called a web application firewall. And it's something that I didn't really start playing with until the past couple of years. But you don't want to prevent your developers from going live with their applications, especially if they've already had critical findings that are like from legacy applications. You can't say, hey, no, you can't ever deploy your code until you fix all the things. That's another way to get you kicked out. But what you can do is you can introduce this cool thing called the web application firewall. And what it does is it will prevent exploitation of things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and it gives those developers time back. It gives them the time that they need to remediate these findings the right way, so they don't have to cut corners or implement spot fixes or rush to try to say, okay, you can't go to production if you have any critical or high findings. This is a way to drop the severity of those findings down and give them back the time that they need to do the right thing. And that will win you a lot of friends in the business. That will inspire hope, trust, and empathy. That will demonstrate that you empathize with the developer's problem, that they have to get features out the door very quickly. It'll give them hope that you're on their side, and it builds trust. And another thing, something that I really like, and you may say, Amelio, all of this application security testing, it's really cool, but does it catch everything? I don't have enough penetration testers to penetration test my apps more than once a year. And so, look, guys, I know that things get crazy and things get crazy very quickly. And priorities are always priorities. There's just never time to catch everything. That's where a bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure program comes in. This has been essential for me in scaling my global AppSec program across the world, because it enables me to have the coverage that I normally wouldn't have for my most critical applications. Now, I'm just curious, raise of hands, how many people here employ a bug bounty program? Okay, a couple hands. How many people here are afraid of bug bounty programs? A couple of more hands. Why? I saw one hand come up. What makes you fearful of bug bounty programs? Oh. If you're willing to disclose.
They have a lot of creativity, and with that, they go outside the boundaries that our systems are designed to structure. So, I mean, they're finding some dark corners. So it doesn't necessarily look good for management, because why did that dark corner exist? But that's kind of our situation.
Okay, fair. I'm sorry. Can you leave the microphone? When you say when you say they get creative and go outside the boundaries, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, our developers are given sort of a structure in how they're to develop the software that we utilize. And when they do their design, if it's clean, we don't have an issue. It's when they leave the openings and those are not discovered until later testing, there's a lot of doubt in the quality of the software development. So the testing isn't as thorough before it's released. I mean, Agile basically says get it out quickly, right? That's kind of the priority there. And I don't think we go through the necessary testing as much as we'd like to. So
yeah.
To admit that you've missed something because of Agile, it rubs the wrong way when senior management's really pushing Agile a lot.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. And I empathize with that, because that's kind of the same thing that happens to the pen test team when I started training QAs on how to identify AppSec vulnerabilities. The executive leadership team came down on the pen test team and said, hey, what gives? Why are we finding all these critical vulnerabilities now? Why didn't you find them? They just didn't have the resources and the capacity to do it. But the same thing goes for customers who find feature bugs. And so, I also agree that there's a level of risk for those who may play outside the bounds, but you have to weigh it. You have to weigh risk versus reward. I would much rather know what my attack surface looks like than eventually find it, or have someone who is motivated by other means find it. And so what I've done with my bug bounty program is actually define clear scope and define boundaries and use, I don't just put on the the company website, like, oh, hey, there's a bug bounty program, like free for all. No, so I'll employ third parties to manage the program for me. And third parties generally do a really good, I mean, it's their job as a vendor to do a good job at this. But it has led to discoveries that my scanning tools just haven't identified. And the very small penetration test team would have no time to otherwise identify. And so it's just a way to help scale, but I hear you. Identifying things that you would expect your internal teams to identify may send a certain message, but I weigh it's essentially doing a cost-benefit analysis, risk-benefit analysis. I weigh I'd rather ask for forgiveness later and explain the why, rather than leave any critical findings that may be out there. And so what I'll close with, and this is going back to saying no, it just won't work. And so as security practitioners, going back to the key takeaways, application security is about building bridges between development, between QA, between IT operations, introducing new bridges that they already have established. You're a new player in the space, and like my message said, who invited them to the table? They don't know you, they don't trust you, just like any other human interaction. Application security, like I opened with, it's very much an organizational behavior practice. We have to ensure that we train the right behaviors and we change the mindset. And so by saying no, by just simply saying no, you can't use ChatGPT. We're training the wrong behavior because like I said, what people are going to do, they're just going to find ways around you. We have to train the behavior that we are there to support the business, and we're not here to stifle innovation. We're here to help innovation grow the right way. And so it's our responsibility to build those bridges and say, hey, we've got these guardrails. Here's how to use them, and here's how we're going to support you in using them. So my job as an ethical hacker, you may think, oh, ethical hacker, you're totally an AppSec guy. You're on the offensive side. You're knocking people over. You were just breaking into everything. No, my job as an ethical hacker was 95% playing defense. My job was writing, I'll say, the translations that I was talking about and helping the developers understand what the pen testers, what compliance was saying. Yeah, they found this SQL injection vulnerability or this mass assignment insecure binder. What does that even mean? Like, what these things mean, and here's how you might think about fixing them. I'm not going to fix them for you, but I'm going to tell you how you might think about fixing them. And then I'm going to build sort of run books for these to help the organization scale. And I will make my team be available for anyone who needs help to implement these fixes. And you know what? We'll even check your fixes for you and help you understand if it was the right thing or not. And so you can't say no. You can't break the build. You can't introduce friction. You have to do the right things for the teams and the business. And you have to, naturally you're going to be seen as an adversary. So by doing all of these things, you're helping shift the mindset that security is actually here to help. We become DevOps is not just a triangle anymore, it's a diamond. And we help facilitate that core team. And we don't force people down any one road. We don't force them to change the infinity sign to be like a square or something. No, we weave into the DevOps fabric to create DevSecOps organically. So I'm actually interested, show of hands, who here has implemented DevOps in their firm, organization? A couple people. Of those hands, have you evolved to a DevSecOps model yet? A couple hands. That's cool. That's awesome. That's great. I mean, this is still a really new concept, and it's very complicated because security has introduced a lot of fear that application security, as a side effect of that, also has to overcome. And so I actually want to apply these learnings and lessons not just to application security, but security as a whole. I'm pretty sure on the infrastructure and patching side of things, a lot of teams push back and say, I can't patch my server because X. Has anyone heard that? You're going to break whatever applications are on that box. And so we have to help overcome that and find solutions in a pragmatic way. And so I'll close with that, and I'll open up for questions.
We are actually over time.
Oh, how over time?
I mean, I could probably take one question, but we're like at time.
Okay. Any questions?
We have a half-hour break, so Amelio could be here if you guys want to have questions with him now on break. So I think we have to wrap.
Okay, let's take it. What are the most used app security testing tools? So I'll ask a clarifying question. Do you mean tools or vendors?
Well, she probably won't get back to you that quick.
Okay. So, I mean, on the application security side, the most common used testing tools are things like static application security testing, which analyzes the source code for vulnerabilities. There's dynamic application security testing, which, much like a QA automation tool, will crawl the UI and simulate actual attacks and test the running application for security vulnerabilities. Oh, I forgot to address one slide. We'll skip over that. It's fine. Static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, software composition analysis, which focuses on looking into your third-party libraries that your application is using for potential vulnerabilities, and also helps you produce that SBOM, that software bill of materials, which is now a buzzword because if you didn't know, next year the federal government says if you have any federal contracts, you have to be producing SBOMs for all your applications, otherwise we're going to sanction you, and there's going to be penalties. SAST, DAST, SCA, container scanning. So if your applications are run inside of containers, there's a way to scan those base images and configurations for vulnerabilities, things like your Docker files. I would say those are the most common. There's also mobile application security testing for any of your mobile apps that also do SAST, DAST, IAST kinds of things.
I think we are at time.
All right. Thanks.